I spent 13 years in the Moscow Times, starting as a rookie reporter, ended up as the chief editor. And then when this law against foreign ownership of the media was adopted, I understood that things will go south from there, so I quit journalism and joined corporate business. I joined Control Risks. Does anyone know what Control Risks is? It's a specialized risk consultancy that supports international businesses doing business in different circumstances in countries like Russia, for example, or China, or in Africa, and supports them by kind of helping them to resolve problems associated with political risk, regulatory risks, business risks, reputational risks, physical risks very often. So I joined 7 years ago, and for the past 3 years, I was the head of our Moscow operation. Like, I had an office in Moscow and the team of 19 people, and got approached by hundreds of different companies with thousands of different issues. And my team helped companies, help clients to resolve these issues. So I got a lot of memory from my media days as a journalist, and also from my experience working with companies and observing their problems and talking to people. And also, it was not mentioned, I had an interesting stint in my career. I spent 2.5 years working for the Russian news agency called RIA Novosti. And I headed the outfit that these days is called Sputnik. The day it became Sputnik, I walked out. At that time, when I worked there, it was called Foreign Language News Service. I had 160 people writing in 11 languages. I speak only English, and kind of I knew what risk is because I got calls from foreign ministry very often saying, what your Arabic editorial house wrote? I said, I don't know, I can't read Arabic, but I was responsible for a lot of people and a lot of operations of which I understood very little. And we'll be speaking today about risks. And risks are usually associated with future, with opportunities or with something terrible that may happen to you. And here is our plan. We will start with looking into future, then learn about government decision making, then with this new knowledge, we'll look into the future again, and then use some strategic imagination to again look into the future, kind of already being enriched with something that I'm going to tell you about. So, Isaac Asimov, American writer, used to say, the safest way to predict future is to speak about obvious things. So, does anyone know what 8780 mean from the policy point of view in the Russian context? Well, I don't think that there are Russia watchers here. These are the results of Putin's elections from the past months. 87 votes for, 80% turnout. But, I mean, we can say these are made up numbers, they are not real, but from the policy point of view, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, our objections against these numbers. But these numbers mean quite a lot. And there is a point of view that these numbers mean that Putin got a mandate. After 2 years into the war, after fierce confrontation with the West, after 2 years of sanctions, record majority of Russians, these are the record numbers, by the way, in Putin's 5 stints, approve his politics and kind of give him mandate to continue the same course. And speaking about the course, where this course will end, there are different views about this topic. The dominating point of view among Russia watchers, among policy experts, is that after achieving certain decision or certain solution in Ukraine, we don't know what kind of solution this will be. Putin will then turn his eyes onto other countries, possibly Baltic countries, possibly Georgia, possibly someone else, and will try to kind of maybe replicate what he's doing in Ukraine, or maybe do something else. There is a different point of view. For example, Stephen Walt from Harvard University says, there is nothing to suggest that after doing what he is doing in Ukraine, Putin will move into something else, because there is a certain kind of, Putin kind of locked up psychologically and emotionally on Ukraine, and we don't observe similar attitude to other countries. But what we can safely predict is, in the next 6 years, during the Putin's term, we do not expect that there will be reverse in Russian politics toward the West. Russia will continue being disruptive. Russia will continue being staunch opponent of the United States, of what Putin describes as unipolar world, and what he describes as hegemony of the United States over Europe and many other countries. So, given this perspective, what's the possible response of the West? And there are actually, if you speak about policies, about strategies, there are not so many different responses. Here I listed them. Hot war, no one wants it. Cold war, most likely. Will the West surrender after Putin, after whatever happens with Ukraine? No, I don't think so. And there is a variant called Pygmalion. That's what Putin is trying to would do with Ukraine if Ukraine would fall quite quickly. But we are not here, and hardly anyone can play Pygmalion with Russia. So most likely, we expect that the Western response will be Cold War-like. But we need to understand that Cold War that we are facing these days is completely different than Cold War that it was like 40, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. Because, sorry, 30 is too little, 35 years ago. Because the world is no longer bipolar like it used to be in the first Cold War. There is the factor of China, there is the factor of middle powers, such as Turkey, and you cannot actually isolate or contain Russia as effectively as the United States and kind of NATO countries could do this during the first Cold War, after the Second World War. So, sanctions, as kind of my favorite topic and something that I'm doing on a daily basis, will remain the biggest kind of element, the most frequently used element of this new containment policy that the West prepares for Russia. In shorter term, in order to kind of diminish Russia's capacity to fight the war in Ukraine, and in the longer term, actually to slow down the Russian economy in order to undermine future Putin's ambitions to actually confront the West and kind of deprive Russia of resources to start a new offensive against the West. First of all, military offensive, but there are also other soft ways of confrontations. So speaking about sanctions, sanctions is a government decision. And there are three ways to look into government decisions in order to understand why they are designed this way and why they are applied this way. And I suggest that we start looking at it from the point of view, first of all, of the rational actor model. And this is the model developed by Graham Allison from Harvard University. You look into the government as if it is a person who is smart and who is trying to make the right thing, who is trying to follow national interests, whose decisions are designed to actually increase utility for the country. And there are 5 national interests as defined by the United States. Let's take United States as an example because their sanctions program is most developed. It has decades of history, and actually it is best developed institutionally with American regulator OFAC kind of being the biggest and most active in implementation and designing sanctions. So if we use rational actor model, when the government designs sanctions, they try to achieve certain national interests. And speaking about American national interests, they are actually written down on paper by the group of American scientists and officials such as Graham Allison and Condoleezza Rice, Robert Blackwill. And while they are not a guiding principle that makes every government official to look into them when they are designing certain policies, it's a good instrument to measure their effectiveness. And five national interests, vital national interests of the United States are not allowing VWMD on the American soil, not allowing unfriendly alliances or countries next to American borders, protecting American allies, protecting existing financial system, global financial system, and not confronting China and Russia as countries who can actually disrupt the previous four vital national interests. So the second way to look into sanctions as they are designed is to look at the organizational process model. The thing is that every government decision is produced by organizations, and we live in the world where the tyranny of our loaded inboxes and the maddening difficulty of getting anything decided and done pushes organizations to work along known patterns. And in the case of sanctions, regulators work along the patterns. They develop lists, for example. A good example of how organizational logic works, for anyone who is following Russia, for example, is Friday announcement of new foreign agents. Every Friday, Russian Justice Ministry announces 5 names of individuals or groups who are being put on the day on the foreign agents list. And every big bureaucracy, in a situation when they face pressure, they need to deliver results, they work according to certain routines. And the routines for example, for regulators working on sanctions is to make a list, and then when the day comes when they need to sanction someone, take part of this list and actually make it public. And the selection of people in the list also goes under certain routines. They are monitoring the media, they are talking to activists, they are talking to investigative journalists, they are talking to consultants like us. They kind of try to get people on the kind of initial list from which they will be sanctioning them. And then there is the third model of understanding and looking on government decision-making related to sanctions is bureaucratic politics model. Because every government decision is also made by people, and it can be influenced by certain personal preferences. So if we look into kind of these 3 levels of decision making, the first level is the state level, the second level is organizational, and the third is personal or political level. A good example of how it manifests when we talk about sanctions is Navalny's death. After Navalny died, dozens of people, his prisoners, were sanctioned like within the next 2-3 days. The sanctioning of prison officials in Russia, like captains, colonels, somewhere in the far north, is a symbolic thing, but something needed to be done. This kind of sanctioning hardly advances American national interests. But it's part of the organizational process because these names were already prepared in advance, just in case. And then the political decision was to make this sanctioning exactly on the same time, like tied to this certain event. The sanctions, when they started being applied, the focus was made on enablers, on facilitators, on someone who helped to evade sanctions. Mainly these were financiers in Cyprus, in Turkey, companies and individuals who would be facilitating evasion of sanctions, like moving Russian oil, or moving Russian money, or opening accounts for Russian oligarchs somewhere in Dubai, or setting up trading companies somewhere in Turkey where they would buy Mercedeses or some luxury cars that are forbidden to be imported into Russia. So they would buy them in Turkey, or somewhere in Kazakhstan, they would buy precision tools that are sanctioned for Russia because they can be part of manufacturing process for arms. And then this stuff, these products, or sometimes services, were smuggled into Russia through these individuals and companies. But the thing is, what is sanctions evasion? What does it require? It's quite a simple thing that requires people with certain knowledge, certain expertise. They know other people, they know how to move money, they know how to build logistics, and they know, and also another thing that requires is some money. So if you go after individuals, after companies that are enablers, it's a whack-a-mole game, because you close the company somewhere in Turkey, you sanction them, or you sanction an individual. So what? You do not remove this expertise from the market. He just sets up another company, or he asks his brother to set up another company, and the process moves. And this whack-a-mole game lasted for about 2 years, until what we started observing is the shift from the elusive targets into more stationary targets. And as I mentioned, within the infrastructure of evading sanctions, there are elusive targets and there are stationary. And stationary targets are, for example, banks. Setting up a trading company in Hong Kong costs $100 and requires 15 minutes. Similar prices and similar time frame is in Turkey or in Cyprus and other places where enablers are active. But setting up a bank is quite a difficult task. You need to get a lot of permissions, and also you need to get a lot of money to start with. And what we see, for example, that major Chinese banks, beginning March, started closing Russian operations. They started refusing any transfers of money, including in yuans into Russia, or stopped accepting yuans from Russia. We see that Turkish banks and banks in the UAE are closing accounts of the Russians. So there is certain result, and also tomorrow Blinken is going to China and will ask actually try to pressure Chinese government to expand these restrictive measures in order to kind of undercut Chinese trade with Russia. But the results are mixed, because banks, yes, they are they can be influenced, because as we understand, global financial system is strongly influenced by the United States. A big part of it is controlled by the United States. But for example, global trade system is not. And also, speaking about other stationary targets, we can speak about national governments. And it's very interesting when the Western governments, the EU government and governments and the United States approach national governments of countries participating, of countries that are being used as springboards for sanctions evasion or product diversion into Russia. There are mixed results. Chinese say no, Turks say no, but the Central Asian stance, some of them say yes, we will comply, we will kind of help you, we will not. Some of them, like Kyrgyzstan, say no, we don't care, we are not listening to you. So this, so far, has not worked so well like it worked with banks. There are other stationary targets. For example, vessels. Russian shadow fleet consists of around 400 vessels that are being used in moving Russian oil above price cap that was introduced by the Western governments in December 2023. So the cap is 60. And Russia is selling nearly at the market rate. But they need to use their own fleet that is usually belonging to small, shady trading companies. Very often, usually they are registered either in Hong Kong or in the UAE. The thing is, you can sanction a vessel. And once you sanction a vessel, and the vessel is always in the black, you cannot turn it into white. So it will be doomed to carry Russian oil in future. This is one thing. And another thing, that services of this vessel, like providing fuel for them, or kind of repairs, or even providing insurance for them, Western companies, major Western companies, will deny it. They will not do it. So again, you will not be only carrying Russian oil, you'll be also carrying Russian oil to China only, or to India, or to countries that kind of defy the Western attempts to fight product diversion for Russia. What we see also, that every month the governments of the United States and the EU and the British government, they produce advisories for companies on what to do in order not to violate sanctions. And it's just a matter of time when these advisories, when these guidances will turn from kind of recommendations into something that the governments will start demanding from companies. And we see actually that there is already laying a ground for criminalization of sanctions evasion. EU, I think European Council already voted 2 weeks ago to criminalize sanctions and to provide and to demand from the EU member countries to change their national criminal codes in order to make sanctions evasion a punishable crime. Not just administrative offense, but something for which people could go to jail. And so just looking into the logic of how the fight against sanctions evolve, the next logical step for the next logical pressure point are the companies themselves. So you produce something, you fail to control your distribution chain, and this something that is sanctionable or sanctioned already or something of a dual use makes its way into Russia. And then you will be punished for this by the regulators because it's your failure and it's your responsibility. It's also kind of very much in tune with the organizational model of the regulators. They're already doing things like this for corruption. There is, for example, American FCPA, Foreign Corruption Act, in which companies that allow their agents on the ground somewhere in Uzbekistan to engage in corruption, these companies are being fined by tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. And initially, this FCPI, if I remember correctly, it was adopted somewhere in late 70s. It was a joke. But after several years and after several hefty fines, it suddenly became one of the most feared regulatory weapon that the government has against global governments, against global companies. So we at Control Risks, together with law firms who work on sanctions with us and who have quite close interaction with regulators, including with the United States regulator, OFAC, believe that it's just a matter of time when the focus will be shifted finally from whack-a-mole game, from going after enablers, because it doesn't produce any results. And the results are needed, because if you don't do this, again, back to our initial thinking, that Russia, in the eyes of the Western governments, need to be deprived of resources. Its economy needs to be slowed down. There is no other way but to do it through sanctions. And to actually effectively enforce these, you need to go after the companies. This would be the biggest nightmare of the CEOs and of the shareholders of the global companies at a certain point. Future. So what companies need to do? What do we tell them to do as a consulting company that actually works with this kind of challenges all the time? You need to map out your business. Just really physically draw a map. Here are my suppliers, here are my distributors, here are my end clients. These guys are selling me water, these guys are selling me electricity, these guys are selling me raw materials, I'm selling here. Once you draw it, you can just look at it closely and see where there is Russian exposure point, where there are leakages to Russia. So it's not just you drew it, you understand all your third parties and you just look where there are Russian shareholders. If there are Russian shareholders, how close they are to Putin? What is their sanctions risk exposure? Are they involved in anything that can actually trigger attention of the global regulators and start looking into them and then at you because you failed actually to recognize the threat? Keep your third parties in check. I'm talking already kind of in business lingo here, but I'll try to say it in quite simple words. If you are working with the company that kind of sells your stuff further down the road, you need to have contractual clauses that are saying you will not be selling if there is a risk that these products may end up in Russia. And you are open to a snap inspection by myself in order to understand whom you are selling to. So you need to create this kind of culture of keeping everyone around you under your control. And the third main thing is to investigate. As we talk to companies who are finding themselves in trouble and trying to kind of do the first two things. For example, I talked recently to a big Nordic company that said, we made a perfect map of our third parties in Western Europe and in Eastern as well. And I asked them, have you done it for Turkey? No. Have you done it for former Soviet Union countries? No. Why? When we approach our distributors there, they tell us to bug off, or they are giving us information that we cannot use, it's clearly made up, or they're selling, we will not be selling to Russia, stop bothering us. That's not the approach. The compliance function, especially in the sanctions environment, needs to be muscular. It requires certain aggression, I would say, from companies actually to demand from their third parties to be open to them and to open up their cards when you demand this from them. And here, let's try to look into the future. It's more of a kind of stimulating intellectual exercise. We are here in the Jesus College, and perhaps the words like what Jesus would do is something that reverberates with many. At the Kennedy School, which is a kind of a policy school, they ask you to start thinking as what would Godfather do? In a very cynical way. So can you approach a problem being free of certain kind of frameworks that limit your imagination, strategic imagination of what to do? If we, for example, are devising or being asked an advice and having assumed that we are thinking as Don Vito Corleone, what kind of sanctions against Russia we would introduce that would really work? Because there is a very strong notion that after 2 years and unprecedented sanctions, they did not work. So I am a big fan of introducing frameworks into any broad policy or political and economic issues. So I would start thinking about national power. Every country has national power, which is a sum of resources that a country can quickly turn into military, effective military power. And they consist of economic resources, human resources, technological, military, and two non-tangible things like strategic purpose. Do people know in this country why they are doing this? Why they are fighting the war, for example? But let's talk about it a little later. Let's start with economic resources, includes money. The current sanctions are trying to address this issue, but if I remember correctly, the last month the government collected more money than ever. And the first quarter of this war was a record quarter in which the Russian government got like collected budget revenues. They were the largest ever. If you are designing a sanctions, Sasha, what would you do to address this issue? How to make Russia weaker economically? What? Completely stop trade. But you can't stop trade. I mean, you can't tell China to stop trading or India. Yeah. So one idea that is being floated by Russian economists, Inozemtsev, for example, is to open doors to Russian oligarchs. Rather than sanctioning them and kind of kicking them back to Putin, say, okay, fine, come over here, bring your money, bring your business, pay a fine, continue working in Russia, kind of, and by doing this, you kind of pump out quite a lot of $1 billion out of the Russian economy. Human resources, people. What? The same. Of course, open door to the Russian qualified workers. They can. And their assets. Exactly. What's the current economic sanctions policy is? To do absolutely the opposite. Technological resources. This is actually something that the current sanctions are trying to address. Kind of, there are restricted lists of goods, technological solutions that they try to prevent. What about military resources? Actually, the same. You can say every Russian officer that changes side will get $1 million and kind of be forgiven if he's not involved in war crimes, something like this. And this can be a cheaper solution. Again, I'm not proposing that this can be done. I'm just trying to think as a godfather would do in this situation, kind of trying to break out of the existing kind of frameworks. Strategic purpose. Has anyone made an attempt to kind of explain to Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine that they are doing the wrong thing? I don't think so. My grandfather during the Second World War was exactly the guy who was standing on the Soviet side, and he spoke perfect German, and he was talking to German soldiers and explaining them and asking them to surrender. Yeah, and no one is doing similar thing like on that side. And likewise, national will is an intangible element of national power. How effectively a leader of the country can turn these resources into the military power. And it depends upon the unity of the elite. Has anyone tried to crack the unity of the Russian elite? So they introduced sanctions against every member of the Russian government, against every oligarch, but they did not give an off-ramp solution, saying, you do this, you'll be forgiven, you can continue life, you can go on with it. It's just a few ideas, again, I would say like intellectual exercises rather than real advices to sanctioning bodies. So what did we learn today? We looked into the future. We got some quick understanding of government decisions. We looked at the case of global sanctions and the risk for companies, and we used our strategic imagination all in 35 minutes. Thank you.